In 1995, Charlie Munger gave a talk at Harvard University which was titled The Psychology of Human Misjudgment. In that talk, Munger went on to explain 24 different cognitive biases and how they force us to take poor decisions. We shall examine 7 of those biases in this video with some examples, and more importantly, we shall look at some steps that one can take to avoid or at least minimize their impact. If you want to listen to the entire talk or read the transcript, then do check out the links that we have made available in the description of this video. Actually, throughout this video, we'll link out a number of related articles and resources that will help you better understand the subject, so do be sure to look out for them at your own convenience. Let's begin. There is a scene in the movie Inception where the protagonist Dom Cobb says, "Once an idea has taken hold of the brain, it's almost impossible to eradicate." Now, Munger says something similar in his talk, that once the human brain is fed an opinion, then it has this tendency of shutting itself to all other opinions. And a lot like the movie, feeding an opinion has 2 parts to it. Part 1 is where an opinion is introduced, which is the easy part. And there is the tougher second part, which is to make a person believe that the said opinion is his own. You see, what happens is that people generally don't jump from an opinion to action. And this process of owning up an opinion is often the result of people doing tiny actions and declarations until there is consistency and it forms a habit. This is something that politicians and marketers understand very well, and one of the more interesting case studies to read up here is how Nestle got a traditionally tea-drinking country like Japan to start drinking coffee. Now, once consistency gets built up, it often leads to a commitment, which is nothing but the tendency in people to stick with the conclusions even if it's the wrong conclusion. It's a harmful bias that we see very often with many investors, and especially the more famous ones who tend to publicly speak about the stocks that they own. The problem with this revealing of stocks is that once you have said it, your brain will continuously force you to defend it. Let's take Bill Ackman for instance. So he went on CNN to say that he will use his personal funds to fight a war against Herbalife, a company whose stock he had started shorting since 2012. He made this public commitment in 2014, and as a result, he continued to hang on to that stock for 6 more years, which came at a great loss to himself and his investors. Our advice: be extra careful when talking about your investments in public, because the more you talk, the more bias your brain will build. As a matter of fact, Guy Spier had this to say in his book, and I quote, "Over the years, I began to realize that it was a bad idea to speak publicly about the stocks that I own. The issue isn't that other investors might steal my best ideas. The real problem is that it messes up with my head. Once we have made a public statement, it's psychologically difficult to back away from what we have said, even if we have come to regret that opinion." It should come as no surprise that self-interest and rewards drive behavior. In that context, the understanding of incentives is the key to understanding people. Charlie Munger in his talk insists that designing the right incentive program is the key to ensuring the right behaviors. He takes the example of FedEx Corporation, which changed from paying employees by the hour to paying them on a per shift basis. The small change in compensation structure evoked a change in behavior and made the system more efficient and accurate, which is what the management was always striving for. Munger goes on to drive this point that if not designed properly, incentives can turn even a decent person into displaying immoral behavior. He cites the example of Xerox salesmen who were promoting a less advanced, more expensive printer to their customers just because the commission on that was higher. The design of commissions and incentive structures have been a big problem area in the financial services industry. This is what entices a financial advisor to pitch an endowment plan over a term plan, a ULIP over a mutual fund, a regular plan over a direct one, and in some cases, an actively managed fund over an index fund. As an investor, it is in your own interest to learn, read, seek a second opinion, and double-check everything that the advisor tells you. To understand the contrast bias, let's run a small experiment. You'll need 2 volunteers and 3 buckets of water. one cold, one hot, and one that's at room temperature. The idea here is to get one volunteer to dip his hand in the hot bucket and the other volunteer to dip his hand in the cold bucket. And after about a minute, the volunteers will transfer their hand into the room temperature bucket. Now, if this experiment is done with enough number of people, the person who was exposed to the hot bucket is likely to say that the second bucket is cold, and the volunteer who started with the cold bucket is likely to find the room temperature bucket a little too warm. This is the contrast effect, and we see it a lot in investing. For example, it's a common trick with real estate agents to show you two highly overpriced houses and one poor quality house before following it up with a moderately overpriced house. This moderately overpriced house is the one that they really want to sell, but by using the contrast effect, the real estate agent tried to present the fourth house as the better deal. In other words, by showing three inferior options first, they are pushing your brain to think sensationally rather than computing the information analytically. We see the same thing in the stock markets as well, with investors showing a lot more excitement in stocks that are nearing their 52-week low. Again, it's the contrast effect at play, as the mind assumes that this 52-week low price is a far better deal as compared to, say, 7 months back when the same stock was available at double the price. To escape these situations, it is important that you think of an item's value in absolute terms rather than in relative terms. For example, although the Tesla stock has relatively lost 18% over the last 1 month, it has also gained over 1,000% in the last 2 years, which also needs to be factored in your decision making. So never get anchored to a number that is presented to you. Ask yourself questions like, what's the correctly appraised value of this house? Or what's the right price at which you should buy this stock? This not only isolates the contrast bias, but it also helps you make a proper assessment of the trade. Social proof is the belief that the majority knows better. It's a mental shortcut that says that the best way, or perhaps the safest way to proceed, is to rely on the decisions that other people are making or have made on previous occasions. This bias can be very powerful in changing behaviors, and if you want to see that in action, then do watch the 3 videos on social conformity that we have linked in the description. Now, the good thing about social proof is that it helps defining what is normal behavior in a particular setting or in a societal framework. This includes things like putting your phone on silent when entering a meeting, being properly dressed when you enter a restaurant, or removing your shoes at a place of worship. On the flip side, social proof can also be very harmful if the consensus itself is wrong. The most popular example of that is what we generally see during stock market booms and crashes, when the majority ends up behaving poorly, often to their own advantage. Now, in our opinion, there are 2 approaches that can be tried to reduce the harmful effects of social proof bias. The first technique is a simple one, and that is to consult a checklist to see if the countervailing theory is correct. More often than not, a properly designed checklist will be able to highlight those gaps. A second workable approach is to get into the habit of seeking specifics and asking why more often. There are always some people, some products or actions that are more likable than others. This leads to biases on our part. For instance, we ignore their faults, we favor a specific set of products, and we also distort facts to facilitate what we love. Additionally, the bias also leads to a lot of extrapolation. For example, people often assume that those who are physically attractive are also more competent, which may not really be the case. Now, we've all heard of the expression, don't fall in love with a stock. It's a way of reinforcing the liking bias and a suggestion that one will be better off by evaluating investments on an analytical basis rather than an emotional one. In fact, the liking bias can show up over the most weirdest reasons. For example, studies show that when companies add the words .com, .net or internet to their names during the first internet boom of the 1990s, the stock price had a 74% improvement over a 10-day period. That's 5 days before and 5 days after the name change announcement. Why did that happen? Simply because investors have a likability for words like the .com and the internet. In fact, it is this understanding of the liking bias that keeps me a little suspicious of my motives when I'm examining stocks which have the words agri-tech, biosciences, life sciences, technologies, or green energy in them. Sometime last year, we did an interesting survey amongst two groups of our office colleagues. To the first group, we asked the question, what kind of a driver you are? That is, are you an above average driver, an average driver, or a below average driver? The results showed us that 76% of the respondents tagged themselves as an above average driver. Now, to the other set of respondents, we asked them to rate the driving skills of other drivers who share the road with them. That is, are the other drivers above average, average, or below average? In this case, 88% of the respondents felt that the other drivers were average or below average drivers. And that's what the excessive self-regard bias is. It is a partiality where people tend to overestimate their own abilities, and the same thread, they also tend to underestimate others. It's something everyone does, and that includes you and me as well. For instance, if some task in the office comes easily to you, that is, you have the required skills, then it is very likely that you would rate that task an easy one and conveniently ignore how the rest of your colleagues find it. Now, when it comes to investing, although confidence and conviction are essential requirements, the excessive self-regard bias can result in people thinking that they are better at picking stocks than what they actually are, which in effect means that when these investments fail to produce adequate returns, people with excessive self-regard will fail to see their own poor decision-making skills in their own misfortune. One effective way to manage this bias is to utilize a checklist, which does a brilliant job of eliminating many of the psychological biases that we have discussed in this video. In fact, a book that should be on everyone's reading list is the Checklist Manifesto by Dr. Atul Gawande, which explains how this simple idea can make a tremendous difference to your investing and to life in general. People tend to follow instructions from an authority figure. In fact, let me rephrase that. People tend to blindly follow instructions given by an authority figure. Parents, your boss, policemen, doctors, each of them possess a certain level of authority on account of their expertise in the subject. Now, obedience to an authority figure has its benefits. It is a quick mental shortcut. There is probably some or a lot of social proof that's embedded in it. You don't have to take any decisions, and one can always look up to the authority figure if something goes wrong. But having said this, obedience can also be very harmful. After all, it's always possible that the leader is wrong, the words can be misunderstood, and worse, the authority figure might be simply manipulating you. Now, one of the most famous experiments in this regards was the one conducted by Yale University psychologist Stanley Milgram in the 1960s. The experiment he designed was used to measure the willingness of participants to perform acts that were against their own conscience, but which were done under the influence of an authority figure. The result of those studies show that in the presence of an authority figure or an expert, the participants' level of obedience towards instructions goes pretty high. The experiment was a bit controversial, and if you want specifics, then do watch a video we have linked in the description, which I'm sure you will find very insightful. Now, investing has no dearth of authority figures. We have stock market gurus and investing experts on Twitter, on Telegram, WhatsApp, Instagram, television, on YouTube. I mean, they are present everywhere, and for any regular investor, it becomes very difficult to ignore their advice. In such situations, be very careful and selective of who you designate as an authority figure, and preferably try to complement a leader's judgment with a checklist or a second opinion. While some of Charlie Munger's biases work in a vacuum, most of them operate on a collective basis. In fact, there is a name for it, and Munger calls it the Lollapalooza effect, which happens when different biases like social proof, contrast bias, confirmation bias, etc. all combine together to sway a person towards a particular course of action. Now, while Munger's talk on biases was given over 25 years ago, it is applicable even more in today's always connected, always moving world. For someone like me, Munger's words are also a reminder that in a world that has so much noise, so much information, it is important to be guided by our highest values and not allow our biases to sway us from our goals. I'd like to close this video by a quote by Munger himself that perfectly sums up what we have learned today. We have a habit of distorting the facts until they become bearable for our own views. So please don't self-distort the facts, understand your biases, take better decisions, like this video, share this video, subscribe to the ETMONEY YouTube channel, and I look forward to catching up with you next week with another insightful video. Until then.
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.